The fluorescent hum of the executive boardroom on the 43rd floor cut through the silence like a saw blade through pine. Leather chairs creaked as 12 men in three-piece suits leaned over contract papers worth $700 million, and the smell of burnt coffee mixed with expensive cologne hung thick enough to choke on. Thomas Whitmore didn't belong there. What happened next would either save Atlas Manufacturing or bury it forever, along with the 4,200 families who depended on those factory floors to keep the lights on. The janitor stood in the doorway with his gray uniform still damp from mopping the executive washroom, his weathered hands gripping a cart loaded with industrial cleaner and wadded paper towels. He was 61 years old that winter of 1977, with silver hair that refused to lay flat and eyes that had seen Detroit's skyline rise and fall twice over. The men at the table didn't look up. They never did. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice carrying the sandpaper texture of 1,000 Pall Malls, "you can't sign that merger." Richard Caldwell, Atlas Manufacturing's CEO, stopped mid-signature. His pen hovered over the dotted line like a vulture circling roadkill. "Security," he said without turning around. "Please escort Mr. Whitmore back to his station." "I designed the hydraulic system you're selling," Thomas continued, taking 3 steps into the room before anyone could stop him. "Patent filed March 9th, 1963. Application number 347821B. I was Atlas's lead engineer for 11 years before you were terminated for insubordination," Caldwell finished coldly. The other executives shifted uncomfortably, their expensive watches catching the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the frozen Detroit River. "Ancient history. Now if you'll... The system has a fatal flaw?" The room went silent. Thomas pulled a folded newspaper clipping from his breast pocket, yellowed with age but still readable. "November 1964. 3 workers died when a hydraulic line ruptured at the Lansing plant. I wrote a memo, 17 pages, detailing the pressure valve defect. Management buried it. Said fixing it would cost too much. Delay production." He laid the clipping on the polished mahogany table. "I wouldn't sign off on the safety report. That's why they fired me." One of the merger lawyers, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, picked up the clipping. His face paled as he read. "Consolidated Industries doesn't know about the defect," Thomas said. "They're buying Atlas for the hydraulic patents, planning to scale production across all their facilities, 15 plants, maybe 20,000 workers on those factory floors." He met Caldwell's eyes. "When those systems fail, and they will fail, people are going to die. And when the lawsuits come, when the families lawyer up and the press gets hold of this, Consolidated will discover they bought a company built on covered-up deaths." The recognition hit the room like a Michigan blizzard. "They'll sue Atlas into oblivion," the lawyer whispered. "Fraud, negligent homicide. The merger protects Consolidated. They can void the contract and walk away. Atlas takes the fall." Caldwell's face had turned the color of ash. That's impossible. We've operated for 15 years without getting caught," Thomas interrupted. "The Lansing incident was ruled equipment failure. The insurance paid out. The memo disappeared into a filing cabinet." He paused, letting the weight settle. "I kept a copy. So did the safety inspector who quit 2 weeks after me. He's ready to testify." Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if this story has you hooked already, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this goes. The second lawyer was already on his feet, briefcase snapping shut. "Mr. Caldwell, We need to halt this signing immediately. If even half of what this man is saying is verifiable." "It's all verifiable," Thomas said quietly. "Every word." Outside the windows, snow had begun to fall over Detroit, soft and relentless, covering the city's scars with a blanket of temporary white. Inside the boardroom, Richard Caldwell stared at the merger contract like it had transformed into a coiled snake. "Why now?" Caldwell asked, his voice hollow. "You've kept quiet for 13 years. Why stop this merger?" Thomas thought of Sarah, his granddaughter, 7 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her grandfather's stubborn chin. She'd asked him last Sunday after church why he cleaned toilets when he used to build machines. He'd told her that honest work was honest work, that a man's worth wasn't measured in titles. But he hadn't told her the whole truth. "Because your merger partner is planning to gut this company the moment the ink dries," Thomas said. "I've been cleaning Consolidated's satellite office for 6 months. I've seen the internal memos in their trash bins. They're buying Atlas to strip the patents, liquidate the equipment, and close every facility within 18 months. He looked around the table at the men who'd once been his colleagues, who'd watched him escorted out by security all those years ago. 4,000 people lose their jobs, and when those defective systems start failing across Consolidated's empire, those 4,000 people get blamed for shoddy work, while the executives walk away clean. The truth hung in the air like smoke. "So here's my offer," Thomas said. "Void this merger. Bring in independent engineers to redesign the hydraulic system properly, the way I tried to do in '64. Make Atlas worth saving." He pulled a second document from his pocket, this one crisp and new. "I've already done the redesign. Nights and weekends for the past 2 years. No defects. 20% more efficient. Patent pending under my name." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "You want to sell it to us?" "I want to license it," Thomas corrected. 5% royalty on every unit produced. And I want my granddaughter's college fund secured." He paused. "And one more thing." The men waited. "I want the families of those 3 workers from Lansing to know the truth." What Richard Caldwell did next would either restore his soul or cement his legacy as the man who let profit bury bodies. The silence in that boardroom stretched like taffy, sticky and impossible to break cleanly. Richard Caldwell's entire empire balanced on what he said next, and he knew it. He stood slowly, his chair rolling backward with a whisper against the carpet. At 54, Caldwell had built Atlas Manufacturing from his father's failing machine shop into one of Michigan's largest industrial suppliers. He'd survived the recession of '73, weathered 3 union strikes, and watched competitors fold like cheap lawn chairs. But the man standing before him now, wearing a janitor's uniform and holding a 13-year-old truth, represented something Caldwell had spent his entire career avoiding: accountability. "Everyone out," Caldwell said quietly. "Except you, Thomas." The lawyers exchanged glances. The Consolidated representatives, 2 men who'd flown in from Pittsburgh that morning, stood with visible reluctance. "Mr. Caldwell, we have a signed term sheet, which includes a 72-hour review clause," Caldwell interrupted. "I'm invoking it. Meeting adjourned." The exodus took 3 minutes. Briefcases snapped shut with the finality of coffin lids. Expensive shoes squeaked against polished floors. The door clicked closed, leaving only Caldwell and Thomas in a room designed to hold 20. Caldwell walked to the windows overlooking the Detroit River. Ice floes drifted south toward Lake Erie, carrying the last remnants of November snow. "I was 26 when my father died," he said. 70 employees, 6 months of operating capital. Every supplier in Michigan waiting to see if I'd collapse. He turned to face Thomas. You were already working here then, lead engineer, 31 years old, you remember? I remember, Thomas said. You came to the floor every morning, asked questions, actually listened to the answers. I needed you, Caldwell admitted. The hydraulic system you designed, that's what saved us. Contracts with Ford, Chrysler, even GM. By 62, we had 400 employees. He paused. What happened to us, Thomas? The question landed heavy. Thomas set down his cleaning cart and sat in one of the leather chairs. The first time he'd sat in this room since 1964. You stopped coming to the floor, he said simply. Started listening to accountants instead of engineers. When I showed you that pressure valve problem, you said fixing it would cost $300,000 and delay production by 6 months. We would have lost the GM contract. 3 men lost their lives. The math hung between them, cold and unarguable. Caldwell returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 54 years. The safety inspector who quit, Marcus Webb, is he really willing to testify? He's been waiting 13 years for someone to ask, Thomas replied. He's got copies of everything. The original incident reports, the internal memo we wrote together, even photos from the accident site that never made it into the official file. Thomas leaned forward. Richard, those men had families. Carl Jennings left behind a wife and 3 daughters. Miguel Santos had twin boys, 6 years old. David Chen's mother worked in our cafeteria for another 8 years before her heart finally gave out. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, edges worn soft. I wrote down their names, every detail I could find, because somebody needed to remember them as more than line items in a settlement check. Why didn't you go public? Caldwell asked. You had the evidence. You could have destroyed us. Because 400 families depended on those paychecks, Thomas said. I was angry, but I wasn't stupid. Going public would have shut us down completely. Everyone loses their jobs, and those 3 men are still dead. He opened the notebook to a page filled with neat handwriting. So I took the only leverage I had, my silence, and I've been waiting for the right moment to spend it. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. And this merger is that moment? This merger is Consolidated's way of acquiring valuable patents while saddling you with all the liability when those systems fail, Thomas said. I've seen their acquisition pattern. They bought Hammond Tool and Die in '75, gutted it within a year. Wexler Manufacturing in '76, same story. They're not buying Atlas to grow it. They're buying it to harvest the patents and liquidate the rest. How do you know this? Because I clean their offices, Thomas said. Including the executive washroom where your merger partner, James Holbrook, takes phone calls he doesn't want overheard. He pulled out a third document, a handwritten transcript dated 2 weeks earlier. I don't eavesdrop, but when a man is screaming into a phone about stripping assets and acceptable losses, well, he shrugged. The acoustics in bathroom stalls are excellent. A sound escaped Caldwell's throat, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. So here's the reality, Thomas continued. You sign this merger, and within 2 years, Atlas Manufacturing becomes a footnote. 4,000 people lose their jobs. And when those defective hydraulic systems start failing, and they will, Consolidated voids the contract, sues Atlas for fraud, and walks away clean while you take criminal charges. He slid his redesign across the table. Or you void the merger, implement my new system, and actually build something worth keeping. Caldwell picked up the technical drawings, his eyes scanning the blueprints with the rusty skill of someone who'd once understood machines before he understood balance sheets. Thomas, this is brilliant. The pressure distribution alone would increase efficiency by 23%, Thomas finished, with zero risk of catastrophic failure. I've run the numbers 500 times, on nights and weekends, while cleaning toilets. Honest work is honest work. The phrase seemed to hit Caldwell like a slap. He set down the blueprints and rubbed his face with both hands. The families of those 3 men, Jennings, Santos, Chen, what do you want me to tell them? The truth, Thomas said. That Atlas Manufacturing failed them. That we chose profit over safety, and that we're going to do better. He met Caldwell's eyes. Set up a trust fund, college scholarships for their children and grandchildren. Not to buy forgiveness. We don't deserve that. But to acknowledge the debt we owe. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, turning the Detroit skyline into a ghost city of gray and white. Somewhere in that city, Thomas's granddaughter Sarah was probably in her 2nd grade classroom, learning multiplication tables and dreaming about what she'd be when she grew up. He wanted her to grow up in a world where truth mattered. If I do this, Caldwell said slowly, if I void the merger and bring you back as lead engineer, because that's what you're asking for, isn't it? Not just a licensing deal, but your old life back. I'm asking for the chance to fix what I should have fixed 13 years ago, Thomas interrupted, and to make sure no other families get a knock on their door telling them their father isn't coming home. Caldwell stood and extended his hand across the mahogany table. Thomas looked at that hand for a long moment. The hand that had once fired him, that had buried evidence, that had chosen quarterly profits over human lives. But it was also the hand of a man who'd just chosen to do the right thing even when it cost him everything. He stood and shook it. What neither man knew was that James Holbrook, Consolidated's CEO, was already on a plane back to Pittsburgh, and he wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully. The coffee in the Atlas break room tasted like burnt rubber and regret, but Thomas Whitmore drank it anyway. 3 days had passed since the boardroom confrontation, and the factory floor buzzed with rumors thick as machine oil. The janitor's cart sat abandoned near the executive elevator, while Thomas stood in his old office, now a storage room filled with obsolete filing cabinets and forgotten equipment manuals. Dust motes danced in the weak December sunlight, filtering through windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. He ran his fingers along the metal desk drawer, finding the scratches he'd made with his wedding ring back when Catherine was still alive, when the future seemed like something you could engineer with the right calculations. Your granddaughter is waiting in the lobby. Thomas turned to find Richard Caldwell in the doorway, holding 2 fresh cups of coffee that actually smelled drinkable. I didn't know Sarah was coming. Her mother dropped her off 10 minutes ago, Caldwell said. Said something about a school project on family history. He handed Thomas one of the cups. Seemed like fate. They walked together through corridors Thomas had mopped for 13 years. Past offices where men he'd once supervised now worked without knowing the janitor pushing the cart had designed half the systems keeping their families fed. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah sat on the lobby's cracked vinyl couch, her backpack decorated with rainbow stickers and her notebook open to a page titled, "My Grandpa's Job," in careful 2nd grade cursive. She looked up as Thomas approached, her face lighting up with the kind of pure joy that made every humiliation worth enduring. "Grandpa, Miss Henderson said we have to interview someone in our family about their work." She held up her notebook. "I told her you're an engineer." Thomas felt Caldwell's eyes on him. Sweetheart, I clean buildings. We've talked about this. But you used to be an engineer, Sarah insisted with the devastating logic of 7-year-olds. Mom showed me the picture of you in your office with all the machines. She said you invented things that help people. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She said some bad people made you stop. Is that true? The recognition hit Thomas like a punch to the solar plexus. He'd never told his daughter the whole story, just that he'd left Atlas over creative differences. But Margaret had been 12 when he was fired, old enough to remember the shouting matches with Caldwell's father, the way Catherine cried over bills they couldn't pay, the shame that settled over their house like nuclear fallout. Of course she remembered. Caldwell cleared his throat. Sarah, would you like to see what your grandfather actually invented? The real stuff, not just pictures. Her eyes went wide. Really? Really? Caldwell looked at Thomas. If your grandfather agrees. Thomas wanted to say no, wanted to keep that part of his life buried where it belonged, where disappointment couldn't touch his granddaughter's innocent faith in a world that made sense. But Sarah was already on her feet, notebook clutched to her chest, looking at him with Catherine's eyes. Okay, he said quietly. But only for an hour. You've got homework. The factory floor roared with the sound of heavy machinery, presses stamping steel, hydraulic lines hissing, conveyor belts carrying components toward assembly stations, where workers in safety goggles performed the same motions they'd perfected over thousands of shifts. The air smelled like cutting fluid and hot metal, familiar as breathing. Sarah held Thomas's hand tight as they walked the main aisle. Workers glanced up, confused to see the janitor walking beside the CEO, leading a small girl through a maze of industrial equipment that could crush bone and bend steel. This is Station 7, Thomas said, stopping beside a massive hydraulic press. See those pressure lines? They control how much force gets applied when the machine stamps parts. Too little pressure, and the parts come out wrong. Too much pressure and the lines break, Sarah finished, proving she'd inherited more than just Catherine's eyes. Like the water pipe that broke in our bathroom last winter? Exactly like that. Thomas pointed to the pressure gauge. I designed this system to regulate the pressure automatically. Supposed to be safer than the old manual controls. But you said supposed to, Sarah noticed. Doesn't it work? Caldwell stepped forward. The original design had a flaw that your grandfather discovered. He tried to fix it, but... He paused, choosing words carefully. But fixing it would have been expensive, and some people thought money was more important than safety. Sarah frowned, processing this with the moral clarity of childhood. That's stupid. Yes, Thomas said. It was. They moved deeper into the factory, past stations where Thomas's original hydraulic systems still operated, 13 years old and ticking like time bombs. He showed Sarah the pressure valves, the relief mechanisms, the safety interlocks that should have prevented catastrophic failure, but didn't account for metal fatigue and cumulative stress. When metal gets squeezed over and over, he explained, it gets tired, like when you bend a paperclip back and forth until it breaks. These systems were designed for 5 years of operation. We're at year 13. Sarah wrote this down in careful letters. So they could break. They could break. And people could get hurt? Thomas knelt to her level. 3 people already did get hurt, sweetheart. A long time ago, before you were born. That's why Grandpa tried to fix the problem. But the bad people stopped you. The scared people stopped me, Thomas corrected gently. Sometimes people make bad choices because they're afraid. Afraid of losing money, afraid of looking wrong, afraid of change. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. But fear doesn't make those choices right. They ended the tour in the engineering department, a warren of drafting tables and filing cabinets where 3 young designers worked on modifications for existing product lines. Thomas recognized the setup from his own days here, though the tools had evolved from slide rules to primitive calculators. Mr. Whitmore, a woman in her 30s, approached, her hard hat marked with the title Senior Engineer. I'm Jennifer Kowalski. I've been going through the archives for the redesign project Mr. Caldwell mentioned. She held up a yellowed folder. I found your original pressure valve specifications from '63. The math is, well, it's beautiful, elegant. I've been trying to figure out how you calculated the stress tolerances without computer modeling. Thomas felt something unlock in his chest, a door he'd kept sealed for 13 years. You use Bernoulli's principle combined with fatigue analysis from materials testing. The trick is accounting for cumulative load cycles over time, not just maximum pressure ratings. Jennifer's eyes lit up. That's what I thought. But the industry standard back then was just using maximum pressure. You were ahead of... She stopped, noticing Sarah. Sorry, engineering talk gets boring. It's not boring, Sarah said firmly. My grandpa is explaining how to keep people safe. The simple statement hung in the air. Jennifer looked at Thomas with new understanding. The Lansing incident, '64. I read the accident report when I started here. It said equipment failure, but... She glanced at Caldwell. But it wasn't really equipment failure, was it? It was design failure, Thomas said. My design. My responsibility. No. Caldwell's voice was firm. It was management failure. Your design was sound. We just refused to implement the necessary updates. He turned to Jennifer, which is why we're implementing them now. Thomas is coming back as consulting engineer. I want his redesign in production within 6 months. The words should have felt like vindication. Instead, Thomas thought about Carl Jennings, Miguel Santos, David Chen. 3 men who'd never know that justice moved at the speed of corporate liability. That truth took 13 years to matter. Sarah tugged his sleeve. Grandpa, are you sad? He looked down at his granddaughter, 7 years old, and already learning that the world didn't always make sense. That good people sometimes lost, and bad choices sometimes won, and fixing things took longer than breaking them. I'm sad it took so long, he admitted, but I'm grateful it's happening at all. That night, after dropping Sarah home and declining his daughter's invitation for dinner, Thomas returned to the small apartment he'd lived in since Catherine died. The walls were bare, except for a single framed photograph. Him at 31, standing beside the first hydraulic press Atlas had installed, grinning like a man who believed in progress. He pulled the Lansing incident file from his briefcase, the one he'd kept hidden for 13 years. Inside were the accident photos, the witness statements, the memo he and Marcus Webb had written documenting the pressure valve flaw. And there, clipped to the back, were 3 funeral programs: Carl Jennings, Miguel Santos, David Chen. He'd attended all 3 services, standing in the back where no one would recognize him, listening to widows and children and parents grieve losses that could have been prevented with $300,000 and 6 months of delayed production. That was the real cost of fear. Tomorrow he'd meet with Caldwell and the lawyers to finalize the trust fund for the families. Tomorrow he'd start implementing the redesign that should have been installed in '64. Tomorrow he'd try to build something worth the 13 years he'd spent pushing a mop. But tonight, Thomas Whitmore sat alone in his apartment and let himself remember the men who'd paid for his principles with their lives. Outside his window, Detroit settled into winter darkness, and somewhere in Pittsburgh, James Holbrook was making phone calls that would turn corporate revenge into something far more dangerous. James Holbrook's office in Pittsburgh smelled like imported cigars and old money, the kind that came from generations of knowing which corners to cut. The merger's collapse would cost Consolidated Industries exactly $700 million in projected revenue, and Holbrook wasn't a man who accepted losses quietly. He sat behind a desk made from reclaimed ship timber, phone pressed to his ear, listening to his lead attorney explain why voiding a signed term sheet wouldn't hold up in court. Through his window, the Allegheny River crawled past steel mills that had survived wars and recessions by understanding one fundamental truth. Sentiment was expensive, and expensive things got eliminated. "I don't care about the review clause," Holbrook said, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone used to being obeyed. Caldwell signed. "We have documentation. Find me a legal angle." "Sir, the issue is the fraud disclosure. If Atlas knew about systemic defects in their hydraulic systems and failed to disclose during due diligence, then we sue them into oblivion and take the patents in bankruptcy court." Holbrook crushed out his cigar with mechanical precision. "But that takes 18 months. I want Atlas operational and under consolidated control by spring, which means I need leverage that moves faster than lawyers." He hung up and opened the file his head of corporate intelligence had delivered that morning. 30 pages on Thomas Whitmore. Employment history, financial records, family connections. The old man was clean, frustratingly so. No debts, no vices, no obvious pressure points. But everyone had pressure points. You just had to know where to apply force. Holbrook picked up the phone again, dialing a number that didn't appear in any corporate directory. "This is Holbrook. I need background on someone. Deep background. Name's Thomas Whitmore, Detroit area, specifically his family. Daughter, granddaughter. I want to know their routines, their vulnerabilities." He paused. "And I want to know by tomorrow." Back in Detroit, Thomas spent his first official day as consulting engineer, reviewing 13 years of maintenance records and finding exactly what he'd feared. The hydraulic systems were living on borrowed time. Station 7 had experienced 3 minor pressure fluctuations in the past 6 months. The kind of anomalies that maintenance crews logged and ignored because the machines kept running. Station 12 showed metal fatigue in 2 relief valves. Station 4's pressure gauge readings were drifting outside tolerance ranges during peak load cycles, all symptoms of systems approaching catastrophic failure. "How long do we have?" Caldwell asked, standing beside Thomas in the climate-controlled records room that smelled like old paper and institutional anxiety. "Best case? 6 months before we see a major incident." Thomas traced a finger down the maintenance log for Station 7. "Worst case? It could happen tomorrow. These systems don't fail gradually. They fail suddenly, catastrophically, and without warning." "Can we shut down the affected stations?" "All of them are affected." Thomas pulled out a plant schematic showing the factory's hydraulic network. "We installed 42 systems between 62 and 64. Every single one has the same design flaw. Shutting them all down means shutting down Atlas completely." Caldwell's jaw tightened. 4,000 people out of work in December, right before Christmas. Or 4,000 people working on machines that could kill them. Thomas met his eyes. "There's no good choice here, Richard. Only less bad ones." They stood in silence. Two men who'd once been friends before money and fear had turned them into employer and employee, into rivals, into strangers. Outside the records room, the factory hummed with the sound of workers who had no idea they were operating equipment on the edge of failure. "How fast can we implement your redesign?" Caldwell finally asked. "6 months for full production. But we can retrofit the existing systems in phases. Start with the highest risk stations, work our way down." Thomas pulled out his redesign blueprints. "We'll need to bring in external contractors. Our maintenance crew doesn't have the expertise for this level of overhaul." Cost? $2 million, maybe 2.5. Caldwell's laugh was bitter. "The merger would have given us $700 million. Now we're spending $2 million. We don't have to fix a problem we've been ignoring for 13 years. He rubbed his face. "The board is going to crucify me." "The board can find new jobs," Thomas said quietly. "The families of dead workers can't find new fathers." The words landed like a hammer. Caldwell looked at Thomas, really looked at him, and seemed to see for the first time the weight the old man had carried for 13 years. "You blame yourself for Lansing, don't you? Even though we overruled you. Even though we buried your report." "I designed the system," Thomas said. "I should have fought harder. Should have gone public even if it destroyed the company. And 400 families would have lost their incomes in '64 instead of 4,000 families risking their lives in '77. Caldwell shook his head. "There's no version of this where you're the villain, Thomas. You did everything right. We're the ones who failed." Before Thomas could respond, Jennifer Kowalski burst into the records room, her face pale. "We have a problem. Station 7 just blew a relief valve. No injuries, but it was close. The pressure spike happened during shift change when the operator was 20 feet away instead of right beside the controls." Thomas and Caldwell exchanged looks that needed no words. 6 months had just become right now. They ran, as much as men in their 50s and 60s could run, through corridors and stairwells down to the factory floor. Station 7 sat silent and steaming, hydraulic fluid pooling beneath the main press like blood from a wound. Workers had evacuated to the safety zone, their faces carrying the unique expression of people who'd just survived something they didn't fully understand. Thomas approached the failed valve, his engineer's eye cataloging the damage. The metal had fractured along a stress line exactly where his original report had predicted. A crystalline failure pattern that spoke of years of accumulated fatigue finally reaching critical mass. "Everyone sees this," he called out to the assembled workers. "This is what happens when we ignore warnings, when we choose schedule over safety, when we let fear make our decisions." He picked up the fractured valve, still hot enough to burn, but he held it anyway. Let the pain focus his thoughts. "My name is Thomas Whitmore. Some of you know me as the janitor who empties your trash. But I used to be the engineer who designed these systems. And 13 years ago, I warned management that this exact failure would happen." The crowd had gone silent. 3 men died in Lansing because no one listened, Thomas continued. Carl Jennings, Miguel Santos, David Chen. They were fathers, husbands, sons. They died because fixing a design flaw cost too much money. He held up the valve. Today, this valve failed during shift change. Tomorrow, it might fail while someone's standing right here. We got lucky today, but our luck just ran out. One of the older workers stepped forward, a man named Eddie Harrison, who'd been at Atlas since the 50s. "What are you saying, Tom? We should walk out? Strike?" "I'm saying we shut down every hydraulic station in this plant until we can retrofit them properly." Thomas looked at Caldwell. All 42 systems, starting right now. The murmur that went through the crowd carried fear and relief in equal measure. No work meant no paychecks right before Christmas, but dead workers didn't collect paychecks at all. Caldwell climbed onto a workbench so everyone could see him. Mr. Whitmore is right. We're shutting down all hydraulic operations effective immediately. You'll receive full pay for the shutdown period. It comes out of executive compensation if necessary. We're bringing in contractors to retrofit every system with Thomas's redesign. The work starts tomorrow. How long? Someone called out. 3 weeks for the first phase, maybe 6 weeks total. More murmurs. 3 weeks was manageable. 6 weeks started getting scary. But alive and scared beat dead and certain. As the workers dispersed and Caldwell started making phone calls to contractors and suppliers, Thomas stood beside the failed valve and thought about how close they'd come. 20 feet. That's how far the operator had been from catastrophic injury or death. 20 feet and the grace of a shift change. Jennifer approached, her hard hat tucked under one arm. Mr. Whitmore, I pulled the Station 7 maintenance logs going back 5 years. The pressure fluctuations started 18 months ago. Small enough that no one flagged them, but consistent with the stress pattern you predicted. She paused. If we'd caught this earlier, we'd still be ignoring it, Thomas finished gently. Because that's what organizations do. They optimize for comfort until reality forces them to optimize for survival. He looked around the factory floor. 42 stations, 4,000 workers, 13 years of deferred consequences finally coming due. Outside, December darkness was falling over Detroit, and somewhere in Pittsburgh, James Holbrook was learning that leverage worked both ways. What he'd do with that knowledge would determine whether Thomas Whitmore's second chance at Atlas became his last. The phone call came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday that smelled like snow and gasoline. Thomas jerked awake in his threadbare armchair, the Lansing incident file still open on his lap. And for a confused moment, he was back in 64, listening to the plant manager's voice crack as he reported 3 fatalities on the night shift. But it was Margaret's voice on the line, and she was crying. Dad, someone broke into my house. They didn't take anything, just left Sarah's room torn apart. Her stuffed animals cut open, her drawings ripped up. The police say it looks like a warning. Her voice dropped to a whisper. What did you do? What's happening? Thomas's blood turned to ice water. Where are you now? At Jenny's house. I grabbed Sarah and ran. Dad, she's terrified. She keeps asking if the bad people are coming back. Listen to me carefully. Thomas was already pulling on his coat, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the buttons. Stay at Jenny's. Don't go home. I'm going to fix this. Fix what? Dad, you're scaring me. I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry. He closed his eyes, seeing Sarah's face when she'd asked if he was sad, her notebook filled with careful questions about his work. I'll call you in an hour. Keep Sarah safe. He hung up and dialed Caldwell's home number. It rang 8 times before a groggy voice answered. Thomas? It's the middle of the... They went after my granddaughter. The words came out flat, emotionless, because emotion would crack him open, and he needed to stay functional. Broke into my daughter's house. Destroyed Sarah's room. 7 years old, Richard. She's 7 years old. Silence on the line. Then, Holbrook. Has to be. This is leverage. He's telling me to back off, or next time they'll do worse than rip up stuffed animals. I'm calling my security team, Caldwell said, suddenly fully awake. And my lawyer. If Consolidated is threatening, your lawyer can't stop what's coming. Thomas interrupted. "This is bigger than contracts and liability. This is about a man who just lost $700 million and wants someone to pay for it." He grabbed his car keys. "I'm going to Atlas. Meet me there." The factory sat dark and silent at 2:30 in the morning, a massive shell of steel and concrete that had birthed prosperity and swallowed lives in equal measure. Thomas's footsteps echoed through empty corridors as he made his way to the engineering department, guided by muscle memory and the emergency lighting that cast everything in shades of institutional green. He found what he was looking for in the back of Jennifer Kowalski's filing cabinet, the complete documentation of the Lansing incident, including the photos that had never made it into official reports. Images of twisted metal and blood-stained concrete. Close-ups of the failed pressure valve showing crystalline fracture patterns identical to what they'd seen at Station 7. And tucked in the back, a handwritten note on Consolidated Industries letterhead. Thomas's hands trembled as he read it by flashlight. The note was dated November 19th, 1977, 2 weeks before he'd interrupted the merger. It was addressed to Caldwell and signed by James Holbrook himself. Regarding the hydraulic system concerns raised during due diligence, Consolidated acknowledges the maintenance recommendations and assumes all liability for existing installations upon completion of merger. Atlas Manufacturing to be held harmless for any incidents occurring post-acquisition. The truth hit Thomas like a sledgehammer. Holbrook had known about the defects. He'd known, and he'd been willing to acquire Atlas anyway, because once the merger was complete, he could blame any failures on Atlas's legacy management while stripping the valuable patents and liquidating everything else. The workers weren't customers to be served. They were acceptable losses in a balance sheet optimization. He was going to let people die, Thomas whispered to the empty room. He knew the systems were failing, and he was going to let it happen. Worse than that, Caldwell's voice came from the doorway. He was going to profit from it. Thomas turned to find Caldwell standing beside Marcus Webb, the safety inspector who'd quit in '64. Marcus looked older, grayer, but his eyes carried the same haunted quality Thomas saw in his own mirror. "Marcus called me an hour ago," Caldwell said, "right after he got a visit from 2 men claiming to be insurance investigators. They wanted to know if he still had copies of the Lansing documentation. They threatened my wife," Marcus said quietly. "Told her accidents happen to people who don't know when to keep quiet." He pulled a thick envelope from his jacket. "So I figured it was time to stop keeping quiet." The envelope contained everything: original accident reports, witness statements that contradicted the official narrative, internal memos documenting management's decision to bury Thomas's safety recommendations, enough evidence to reopen the Lansing investigation and potentially bring criminal charges against Atlas's former leadership. "This destroys us," Caldwell said, looking at the documents spread across Jennifer's desk. "Every bit of this proves we knew about the defects and covered them up. The lawsuits alone would put the families of those 3 men in front of a jury with proof that their husbands and fathers died because we chose profit over safety," Thomas finished. "Which is exactly what should happen. Even if it means Atlas closes permanently, 4,000 people lose their jobs? Even then." Thomas met Caldwell's eyes. "Because the alternative is letting Holbrook win, letting him threaten children to protect corporate fraud, letting him acquire companies knowing their systems will fail and workers will die, all because it's cheaper to settle wrongful death suits than implement proper safety measures." The moral calculus hung between them like smoke. Caldwell walked to the window overlooking the factory floor. 42 hydraulic stations sitting silent in the darkness, waiting for contractors to begin the retrofit work that should have happened 13 years ago. My father built this company with his hands. Literally, he welded the first frames himself, worked 18-hour days, believed that honest work and fair wages could build something that lasted. His voice cracked. I turned it into exactly what he feared. A place where quarterly earnings mattered more than the people who generated them. Then let's turn it back, Marcus said. Not by hiding what happened, but by facing it. Release everything, Lansing, the cover-up, Holbrook's willingness to acquire defective systems. Let the world see what corporate greed actually looks like. They'll crucify us, Caldwell whispered. Probably, Thomas agreed. But we'll die standing instead of living on our knees. The decision crystallized in that moment. Not a choice between good and evil, but between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths. Between protecting reputations and protecting lives. Between the kind of man Richard Caldwell had been and the kind of man he could still become. Do it, Caldwell said. Contact the press, the FBI, release everything. He turned to face them. But first, we're getting Thomas's daughter and granddaughter somewhere safe. Somewhere Holbrook's people can't reach them. I know a place, Marcus said. My brother runs a farm in northern Michigan. No phone. Off any grid Consolidated would think to search. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief because the danger was far from over, but a kind of grim satisfaction that comes from finally choosing the right thing even when it costs everything. Outside, the first flakes of December snow began to fall over Detroit, soft and relentless, covering the city's sins with temporary white. And somewhere in Pittsburgh, James Holbrook was about to learn that threatening a man's family didn't create leverage. It created enemies with nothing left to lose. The press conference was scheduled for 10 o'clock on Thursday morning in a downtown Detroit hotel that smelled like stale carpet and forgotten conventions. By 9:30, the room was packed with reporters who'd been promised the biggest corporate corruption story Michigan had seen since the automotive scandals of the 60s. Thomas stood backstage with Caldwell and Marcus, watching through a gap in the curtain as camera crews set up lights and microphones. His daughter Margaret sat in the front row with Sarah, who'd insisted on coming despite her mother's protests. The little girl wore her best dress, the blue one with white flowers that Catherine had bought her last Christmas, and held Mr. Buttons, the teddy bear she'd offered Emma Sterling in that borrowed script from another story. Except this teddy bear was named Captain Whiskers, and he'd been Sarah's companion since she was 3. You don't have to do this, Caldwell said quietly. I can take full responsibility. Your name doesn't need to be. My name has been attached to this for 13 years, Thomas interrupted. I designed the systems. I warned about the flaws. I kept quiet when I should have spoken. He straightened his tie, the same one he'd worn to Catherine's funeral, the only good tie he owned. If we're burning it all down, I'm standing in the fire with you. A hotel staffer knocked on the door. 5 minutes, gentlemen. Marcus pulled out the Lansing documentation one last time, checking that everything was in order. Photos, memos, witness statements, the original accident reports, and the crown jewel, Holbrook's letter acknowledging the defects and assuming liability post-merger. Proof that Consolidated's CEO had knowingly planned to acquire failing systems that would kill workers while protecting his company from legal consequences. Once we release this, there's no taking it back, Marcus said. Atlas will face criminal investigation. Holbrook will sue for defamation. The families of those 3 men will have grounds for wrongful death claims that could bankrupt the company. Good, Thomas said simply. Let them sue. Let the truth cost what it costs. They walked onto the stage to a wall of camera flashes that turned the world white and explosive. Thomas blinked against the lights, finding Sarah's face in the crowd, her small hand waving at him, her smile carrying the kind of unconditional faith that made lies impossible. Caldwell approached the microphone first, his prepared statement crisp in his hands but trembling slightly at the edges. My name is Richard Caldwell, CEO of Atlas Manufacturing. I'm here today to confess to criminal negligence, corporate fraud, and the wrongful deaths of 3 workers in 1964. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions over each other. Cameras clicked like mechanical insects. And somewhere in the back, someone knocked over a light stand with a crash that sounded like the future collapsing. Caldwell waited for silence, his face carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from finally telling a truth you've spent years avoiding. On November 7th, 1964, 3 men died at our Lansing facility when a hydraulic system failed catastrophically. The official report listed equipment failure as the cause. That was a lie. He detailed everything: Thomas's warnings, the buried memo, the calculated decision to prioritize production schedules over safety retrofits. He showed the original accident photos on an overhead projector, and even hardened reporters flinched at images of twisted metal and the aftermath of industrial violence. The engineer who designed these systems warned us this would happen, Caldwell continued, gesturing to Thomas. Thomas Whitmore documented the pressure valve defects and recommended immediate corrective action. We fired him for insubordination rather than spending the money to fix the problem. His voice cracked. 3 men died because we chose profit over people. Carl Jennings, Miguel Santos, David Chen. Their names should be remembered alongside ours when history judges this company. Thomas stepped to the microphone, and the room's energy shifted. Reporters leaning forward, sensing that the janitor who'd worked in obscurity for 13 years was about to become the most important witness in a criminal investigation. I'm Thomas Whitmore, he said, his voice carrying the sandpaper texture of someone who'd spent too many nights alone with regret. I designed the hydraulic systems that killed those 3 men. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but through incomplete engineering and failure to account for long-term stress factors. He paused, letting the weight settle. When I discovered the defects, I had a choice: keep quiet and keep my job, or speak up and face consequences. I chose to speak up. Management chose to fire me rather than fix the problem. He pulled out the Lansing documentation, holding it up so cameras could see the thickness of evidence. Hundreds of pages documenting corporate negligence that had been hidden for 13 years. This contains proof that Atlas Manufacturing knew about the defects, covered up the accident investigation, and continued operating dangerous equipment for more than a decade. He said it on the podium like a judge delivering sentence. 3 weeks ago, the same defect nearly killed another worker. The only reason we're not planning a 4th funeral is luck and timing. Marcus Webb stepped forward to corroborate everything, his testimony carrying the weight of an independent safety inspector who'd sacrificed his own career trying to prevent exactly this moment. But the real bomb dropped when Caldwell revealed Holbrook's letter. 2 weeks before our scheduled merger, I received this communication from James Holbrook, CEO of Consolidated Industries. Caldwell read the letter aloud, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was exposing. Mr. Holbrook acknowledged the maintenance concerns with our hydraulic systems and stated that Consolidated would assume all liability post-acquisition. In other words, He knew the systems were defective. He knew workers were at risk, and he planned to acquire Atlas anyway. Because once the merger was complete, any deaths or injuries would be legally separated from Atlas's historical negligence. The room exploded again. This wasn't just one company's cover-up anymore. This was systemic corporate malfeasance at the highest levels. When I tried to void the merger based on Mr. Whitmore's warnings, Caldwell continued, Consolidated responded by threatening his family. Last Tuesday, unknown individuals broke into his daughter's home and destroyed his 7-year-old granddaughter's bedroom. The message was clear: cooperate or face consequences. Thomas felt Sarah's eyes on him and couldn't look at her. Couldn't see her process the reality that someone had targeted her because her grandfather had tried to do the right thing. A reporter from the Detroit Free Press stood. Mr. Caldwell, are you saying James Holbrook personally ordered these threats? I'm saying that within hours of voiding our merger, Thomas Whitmore's family was targeted. I'm saying that Marcus Webb, our former safety inspector, received similar threats when he indicated willingness to testify. I'm saying that Consolidated Industries has a documented pattern of acquiring companies with known safety defects, then using bankruptcy and liability transfers to avoid responsibility when workers die. Caldwell's voice hardened. And I'm saying that we're done being complicit. The questions came like machine gun fire after that. How many other Atlas systems were defective? Had they notified current workers? What criminal charges were they facing? Would they cooperate with federal investigation? When would the families of the Lansing victims be compensated? Thomas answered with surgical precision, providing dates, numbers, technical specifications, the kind of detailed testimony that would make prosecutors salivate and defense attorneys panic. He explained the retrofit plan, the 3-week shutdown, the $2 million in corrections that should have been implemented in '64. And then a young reporter from a local television station asked the question that changed everything. Mr. Whitmore, why now? You've known about this for 13 years. Why come forward today? Thomas looked at Sarah, sitting in the front row with Captain Whiskers clutched to her chest. Her blue dress with white flowers reminding him of every Sunday morning when Catherine was alive and the world still made sense. Because my granddaughter asked me about my work, he said quietly. She wanted to know what I do, what I've built, what I've contributed to the world. And I realized I couldn't look her in the eye and lie anymore. His voice strengthened. I couldn't tell her that integrity matters while I stayed silent about deaths I could have prevented. I couldn't teach her that truth is important while I participated in a cover-up. So I'm standing here today, not because I'm brave, but because staying silent had finally become more terrifying than speaking up. The room went silent. My granddaughter is 7 years old, Thomas continued. She believes the world is fundamentally fair, that good people win and bad people lose, that telling the truth matters even when it's hard. He looked directly at the cameras, knowing Holbrook would be watching. I refuse to live in a world that proves her wrong. So if James Holbrook wants to threaten my family, if he wants to sue me into bankruptcy, if he wants to destroy everything I have left, fine. Do it. But he's going to have to do it in public, with cameras rolling, while the whole world watches him punish an old man for trying to save lives. The challenge hung in the air like a declaration of war. As the press conference ended and reporters rushed to file stories that would dominate the evening news, Thomas walked down from the stage to where Margaret and Sarah waited. His daughter was crying silently, her face a mixture of pride and terror. But Sarah just wrapped her arms around his waist and whispered, "You were really brave, Grandpa." "No, sweetheart," Thomas said, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "I was just finally telling the truth. Being brave would have been doing it 13 years ago." "But you're doing it now," Sarah said with the devastating simplicity of childhood wisdom. "That still counts." Outside the hotel, Detroit was waking up to a story that would reshape corporate accountability for decades to come. Federal investigators were already preparing subpoenas. Consolidated stock was beginning its freefall. And somewhere in Pittsburgh, James Holbrook was learning that some battles couldn't be won with money and threats. Some battles required something he'd never learned to value: the truth. Spring came to Detroit like a cautious promise. Melting snow revealing a city that had survived another winter. 3 months had passed since the press conference that detonated across national headlines and congressional hearings. The Atlas manufacturing plant hummed with a different rhythm now. 42 hydraulic stations retrofitted with Thomas Whitmore's redesign, operating with safety margins that turned what had been ticking time bombs into precision instruments. The work had taken 8 weeks instead of 6, cost $3 million instead of $2 million, and required Caldwell to sell his summer home and his vintage car collection to keep payroll flowing. But nobody had died. Thomas stood on the factory floor in a crisp white shirt and his old engineer's hard hat, the one he'd kept in a closet for 13 years, like a relic from a previous life. Workers nodded as he passed, some with respect, some with wariness, all with recognition that the janitor they'd barely noticed had saved their lives by refusing to stay invisible. "Station 7 is running at 98% efficiency," Jennifer Kowalski reported, her clipboard filled with metrics that would have made Thomas's 63 self weep with joy. "No pressure fluctuations, no valve stress, no anomalies. Your redesign is performing exactly as modeled." "It's not my redesign anymore," Thomas corrected gently. "It's ours. You and your team made it better than I ever could have alone." The engineering department had grown from 3 people to 12. Young designers recruited from Michigan Tech and Wayne State who wanted to work for a company that had chosen truth over profit. Atlas had become something unexpected in the aftermath of scandal. Proof that corporations could survive transparency, that admitting failure could be more profitable than covering it up, that workers would fight for a company that actually fought for them. But survival had come at a cost measured in more than money. The Lansing families had filed wrongful death suits totaling $40 million. The state of Michigan had opened a criminal investigation into corporate negligence. OSHA had levied the largest fine in its history, and James Holbrook had made good on his promise to destroy anyone who'd exposed his acquisition strategy. Consolidated Industries' lawsuit against Atlas and Thomas personally sought $200 million in damages for defamation, tortious interference, and breach of contract. Holbrook's legal team had filed motions in 3 states, frozen Atlas's accounts, and made it clear they intended to litigate until everyone involved was bankrupt or dead. "Mr. Whitmore?" A young woman stood near Station 7, her hand resting on the retrofitted pressure valve with something approaching reverence. She had Miguel Santos's eyes, his daughter, now grown, now working at the plant her father had died trying to provide for. "I wanted to thank you for telling the truth about Dad." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry I didn't tell it sooner." "You told it when it mattered," she said simply. "The settlement money is sending my kids to college. Dad would have liked that." The Lansing families had reached an agreement with Atlas, $30 million in total compensation, college scholarships for all descendants, and a permanent memorial on the factory grounds listing Carl Jennings, Miguel Santos, and David Chen by name. Not as statistics or line items, but as men who'd mattered. Caldwell had liquidated nearly everything to fund it, but he'd slept better in the past 3 months than he had in 13 years. Thomas. Marcus Webb approached, his expression grim. "We need to talk, privately." They retreated to Thomas's new office, a modest space that smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. Marcus closed the door and pulled out a legal document stamped with federal seals. "The FBI finished their investigation into Consolidated," Marcus said. "Holbrook's been indicted on 17 counts, including racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and witness intimidation. They traced the men who broke into Margaret's house, contract workers hired through a shell company that leads back to Consolidated's security division." Thomas felt something unclench in his chest. "So it's over?" "The criminal case is over. Holbrook's looking at 20 years minimum." Marcus hesitated. "But the civil suit is still active. His lawyers are arguing that even if Holbrook acted criminally, Atlas still breached the merger contract, and Consolidated as a corporate entity deserves damages." "Let them argue." Thomas looked out his window at the factory floor where workers operated machines that wouldn't kill them. "We told the truth. Whatever it costs, it was worth it." "Even if it costs Atlas itself?" Marcus asked quietly. "Because that's what Caldwell's lawyer thinks will happen. The Lansing settlements, the OSHA fines, the retrofit costs, and now $200 million in civil liability. The numbers don't work. Atlas Manufacturing might not survive the year." The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. They'd saved the company by exposing its crimes, and the exposure might destroy it anyway. "Then we close with our heads held high," Thomas said, "knowing we did right by the families, by the workers, by everyone we'd failed for 13 years. There might be another option." Caldwell entered without knocking, his face carrying an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Behind him came a woman in a sharp business suit, her briefcase embossed with a law firm Thomas recognized from newspapers, the kind that represented unions and worker cooperatives. "Thomas, Marcus, this is Amanda Chen," Caldwell said. "David Chen's daughter. She's an attorney specializing in corporate restructuring." Amanda shook their hands with her father's firm grip. "Gentlemen, I've been reviewing Atlas's financials and legal exposure. You're right that bankruptcy is likely under the current structure." She opened her briefcase, pulling out documents. "But what if Atlas Manufacturing didn't survive as a traditional corporation? What if it became something else?" "I don't understand," Thomas said. "An employee-owned cooperative," Amanda explained. "You dissolve the corporate entity, transfer ownership to the workers themselves, and restructure the debt as operational obligations that the co-op assumes gradually. Consolidated can't sue a company that no longer exists in its previous form. The workers become stakeholders with voting power over safety decisions, compensation, and long-term strategy." Marcus leaned forward. "That's legally possible?" "It's been done before, usually when companies fail, not when they're trying to do right." Amanda's smile carried an edge. "But Atlas isn't failing because of market conditions. It's failing because it chose justice over profit. That's exactly the kind of transition that bankruptcy courts and labor organizations will support." Caldwell sat heavily in one of the chairs, looking older than his 54 years, but somehow more solid, more real. "I'd lose everything. The company my father built, my ownership stake, my legacy." "You'd lose the corporation," Amanda corrected. "But you'd keep the mission. The workers would vote on whether to retain you as managing director." "I suspect they would, given that you're the one who chose transparency over self-preservation." You'd just answer to them instead of shareholders. The proposal sat on the table like a gift nobody knew whether to accept. Thomas thought about the factory floor, about workers like Miguel Santos's daughter, who operated machines her grandfather had died building. About Sarah asking what he'd contributed to the world. About Catherine's voice reminding him that honest work was honest work, regardless of who signed the paychecks. The workers deserve that choice, he said finally. Let them vote on it. Let them decide whether Atlas is worth saving and on what terms. The vote happened 2 weeks later in the factory cafeteria that smelled like coffee and possibility. 4,000 workers crammed into a space designed for 500, spilling into hallways and break rooms, listening through improvised speaker systems as Caldwell explained the proposal. If you choose this path, he told them, you'll own Atlas Manufacturing. Every decision, safety protocols, wages, production schedules, will be yours to make democratically. But you'll also own the debt, the legal exposure, the uncertainty. There's no guarantee we survive. No guarantee this works. Eddie Harrison, the worker who'd been at Atlas since the 50s, stood. Mr. Caldwell, with respect, we've been owning the risk all along. We're the ones who operated machines you knew were defective. We're the ones who could have died while you collected paychecks. At least this way, if we fail making our own choices. The vote was unanimous. 6 weeks later, Atlas Manufacturing Cooperative held its first worker assembly. Thomas stood beside Caldwell as the ownership papers were signed, transferred, notarized. 4,000 people became shareholders in their own labor, architects of their own safety, stewards of a legacy built on bones, but rebuilt on truth. That evening, Thomas walked through the factory one last time as consulting engineer before his official retirement. He stopped at the memorial that had been installed near Station 7. 3 bronze plaques bearing the names and faces of Carl Jennings, Miguel Santos, and David Chen. Fresh flowers sat in holders beneath each name, replaced weekly by workers who'd never met these men, but understood the weight of their sacrifice. Grandpa! Sarah ran across the factory floor, Captain Whiskers tucked under one arm and a drawing in her other hand. Margaret followed more slowly, her face no longer carrying the perpetual worry that had marked the months when they'd hidden at Marcus's brother's farm. Look what I made, Sarah announced, holding up her drawing. It showed a man in a hard hat standing beside a machine, surrounded by workers with smiling faces. At the top, in careful second-grade handwriting, "My grandpa saves people." Thomas knelt, his 61-year-old knees protesting, and pulled his granddaughter into a hug that tried to contain 13 years of regret and 3 months of redemption. I didn't save anyone, sweetheart. I just finally stopped being afraid. That's the same thing, Sarah said with the devastating wisdom of children who haven't yet learned to separate courage from kindness. Outside the factory windows, Detroit stretched toward a horizon painted in orange and purple, a city that had survived depression and riots and industrial collapse by understanding one fundamental truth: that worth wasn't measured in quarterly earnings, but in the dignity of labor honestly performed. Atlas Manufacturing Cooperative would survive another 40 years, becoming a model for worker-owned industry that balanced profit with humanity. James Holbrook would die in federal prison, his empire dissolved, his name synonymous with the kind of greed that consumed everything it touched. And Thomas Whitmore would live to see his great-grandchildren graduate from college on scholarships funded by the families who'd forgiven him for taking 13 years to find his voice. But all of that was future, and futures are built from present choices. Tonight, Thomas stood in a factory that no longer carried the weight of covered-up deaths, holding a granddaughter who believed truth mattered, working for a company that proved survival and integrity weren't mutually exclusive. It wasn't redemption. You couldn't redeem 3 lives taken by negligence. But it was a start. Some say if you walk past the old Atlas factory late at night, you can still hear the hum of hydraulic systems running true. And if you listen carefully, 3 voices carried on the Detroit wind, finally at peace. If this story moved you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And hit subscribe, because the best stories are the ones that remind us courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to speak truth anyway.